Hi, and thank you for joining me for another video. And friends, I thought I should make a pretty quick video explaining what is the oral law. Just because I realized that many had a problem understanding my latest video, mainly because many had an erroneous notion of what is oral law. So first and foremost, I have to make sure that you know what is the written law. Friends, the written law, or Torah Shebiktav, is the 5 books of Moses, but specifically the commands or instructions within it, also just known as the Torah. And this does not include other books of the Hebrew Bible like the prophets. Now, we know that everything we believe has to be sanctioned and authorized within the 5 books themselves. So, in the 5 books, we're commanded to heed the instructions of the court or judges. The court is what became known as the Sanhedrin, or the Great Court, or the Beit Din HaGadol. And the rulings or the decisions of this court is what ultimately became known as oral law. Why was it called oral? Because unlike the written law that never changed and really was the pillar for everything that exists in Judaism, their law, the laws of the judges, were just there to protect the written law, and thus were charged to develop a set of laws that would change depending on the times that the Jews lived in, and never was meant to ever intentionally become static. In other words, there were laws that traveled orally from court to court instead of the constant written law that never changed. Why did we need an oral law? Easy, friends, because it would almost be impossible to run a society without it. In other words, it was the job of the oral to keep Israel living the written Torah in a unified manner. I mean, can you honestly imagine if every Israelite was expected to keep the laws within the Torah the way he or she saw fit? People would keep holidays on different days, they would slaughter animals differently, and the priests would disagree amongst themselves on how to perform the temple services, which is what we see with Karaite Jews, who eventually had to develop an oral law for themselves to try to keep Torah in a unified manner. So in other words, the Almighty took this into account when he himself commanded us in Torah to adhere to the instructions of the Great Court. Actually, if you think about it, all other religions have a similar model. I mean, that they have other works that unify their people on some common understanding of their central source text, like the Hadith to the Quran or the letters of Paul to the Gospels. However, one principle, at least from a Judaic perspective regarding the court's rulings, is that it can never add on to the commands of Torah or contradict them in any way. In other words, if it does create a practice or a custom, let's say like Purim, it is always correctly labeled rabbinic and not Torah. Although, even if it did come from the court sitting on the Temple Mount, it would still be binding from a Torah level. And that also goes for establishing metaphysical reality. Only Torah, the source text, in our sense, given by God himself, can determine those things. And not to mention because these rulings are still man-made and not from God. Although, like we said, God himself sanctioned their authority to rule in Torah. And unfortunately, friends, you will see that this is not a distinction made today. No, friends, today, everything, whether rabbinic or from the Torah, is held to the same degree. Mainly because the mystics have mystified the court's legal rulings that ultimately make us think that they, because they're mystical now or on a metaphysical level, are not just created by man, but are in some way equivalent to Torah themselves. Chas v'shalom. So, what is the oral Torah today, and where does it come from? Well, friends, one of the portions in Torah that justify the creation or establishment of the Great Court is, like we said, Deuteronomy 17 in Parshat Shoftim, which tells us that this court would judge only from the place that God would choose, which we all know was eventually Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. In other words, their Torah authority to judge only existed while they ruled their court from the Temple Mount. So after the temple was destroyed and the Jews were dispersed to the ends of the earth, the rabbis felt that this was going to be a very, very long exile, as prophesied by the earlier prophets. So they decided to compile the remaining rulings that were not expected to change because they were no longer on the Temple Mount in a book called the Mishnah. In other words, if they felt that the court would have been restored in any way, they would have never compiled the Mishnah. And that's why they never created it earlier, mainly because the court was still in session. In other words, laws were still changing and adapting. Now, friends, you're probably wondering, how were the members of the court chosen? Well, easy. Just like they're chosen today by the court itself. In other words, nothing fundamentally new took place in the Jewish world without their rulings, and even the electing of one of their own. Actually, this is how Moses elected them, by putting on them what God had initially placed on him. This process was also known as smicha, and even within smicha itself, there were different variations of smicha. And these individuals who had smicha, in other words, ordination, were the ones known as the rabbis. So no, your rabbi today, even myself, do not have authentic smicha, solely because the chain of transmission and authority was broken long, long ago. So actually, anyone with the title rabbi today only holds ceremonial smicha, created during the Renaissance by Jewish teachers to, in a way, have a respectful title for Israel's clergymen. So no, there are no real rabbis today from at least a Talmudic authoritative perspective. Which is a few reasons why those who know halakha and Torah find it ridiculous when leaders today try to change Judaism from an authoritative perspective when they are not part of an authorized Sanhedrin. And no, friends, this current Sanhedrin that was formed a few years ago in Yerushalayim is not a real one. Actually, I don't really know what it is. So, anyways, friends, to quickly recap, Judaism, in terms of binding practice, closed its doors after the destruction of the Second Temple. In other words, no one else had the authority to establish binding law. Now, your next question probably is, how was it that the Sanhedrin existed in other places like Tiberia or Yavne before it was abolished? In other words, if they were away from the Temple Mount, how did they hold any power? And the truth is that from a Torah perspective, they no longer had any authority. However, from a national perspective, they did, because they were still the judges of Israel. So their laws is what became known as fully rabbinic ordinances, unlike the ordinances that were developed on the Temple Mount that had a binding Torah authority along with them. No, friends, these were only expected to be kept from a nationalistic perspective. Additionally, the Rambam himself even explains that before they were exiled from the Temple Mount, they ruled their new form of authority into existence for unity's sake. But this rule could never override rulings authorized from Torah, that again, from a Torah perspective, only derived from the Temple Mount. Okay, good so far? So, what constitutes oral law? Easy, friends. The rulings of the court and their legal interpretations of certain portions of the written law, and that's it. So where can we find the oral law? Well, if I had to give you one work that would encompass all of the oral law, it would have to be the Mishnah. Although the whole Mishnah is not oral law. There are actually many portions within it that are just folklore or even advice. Now, because the Mishnah itself was really compiled in such a terse fashion, it gave birth to works whose sole goal was to interpret the halachic concepts within the Mishnah. And that's the Talmuds, both of them, Bavli and Yerushalmi, along with the Sifra, the Sifri, the Tosefta, and the Mechilta. And these works give us a complete understanding of oral law, although these books in themselves are not considered oral law, but rather the oral law is within them, along with other things like we said, advice and legends, which are not part of the oral law for the simple fact that they contain no law. Long story short, the doors of the oral law and halakha, which is the practical application of oral and written law, were shut with the disbandment of the Sanhedrin, the Great Court, shortly after the destruction of the Second Temple. Which means that no one could create, modify, or dissolve halakha or Jewish law from then on. And no matter how great the rabbi may be, everything he says and will ever say will only exist in the realm of opinion, and disposable opinion at that. Whether it's Rashi, the Rambam, the Chafetz Chaim, and whoever came after the court that did not sit on the court, my friends, does not actually speak for Judaism. Not to mention the mystical works that are not legal in nature, like the Tanya, the Zohar, no matter when they were written or by whom they were written. If what's being taught or expounded on does not derive from the Mishnah or the Torah, it's ultimately not considered Judaism. So, what would be the simplest way to learn the oral law today? Well, the simplest way is to get a codification of the oral law. In other words, a work that has done the daunting task of extracting all the oral law from the works I just mentioned, from both Talmuds, not to mention the Sifra, the Sifri, the Tosefta, and the Mechilta. In other words, a work that put all the applicable laws in a concise format for us to learn. And honestly, friends, to date, there's only really one work that has done this completely, and that's the Rambam's Mishnah Torah. Now, there are other works that have tried, like the Shulchan Aruch, but never completely finished codifying all the oral law, which leaves parts of its codification suspect, mainly because his work, the work of the Mechaber, lacked the presence of the complete code to confirm many of the Shulchan Aruch's opinions against it. And friends, please beware of twisted ideas floating around regarding the oral law, such as that we Jews believe that it was given along cite the written law on Mount Sinai, or that we consider it divinely inspired, or that everything a rabbi teaches even today is considered oral law, or that we Jews consider works like the Zohar, the Tanya, or Kabbalah in general to be part of the oral law. Now, there are a set of laws known as Halacha Moshe Sinai, which the Rambam limits to around 30 laws, which the rabbis stated must have derived directly from Hashem on Har Sinai. But again, even this understanding is one that's rabbinic in nature and not one that's completely metaphysically true, although these laws are still 100% binding from a Torah level. And friends, you must never, never forget that it is the written Torah that is our basis. In other words, that we are Torah Jews first and foremost, and Rabbinic Jews secondly. And again, only Rabbinic because its job is solely to amplify and magnify the written law. My friends, for more information on everything Jewish, please visit doordea.com. Thank you.